Number 532, interview with John Loftus about Unholy Trinity and Intelligence Summit. This is being recorded on November 6th of the year 2005. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves John Loftus, author of, among other titles, The Belarus Secret, The Secret War Against the Jews, and Unholy Trinity, the last two books co-authored with Mark Ahrens. John, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you, Dave. Pleasure to be here.
About that same time, there was a story that impinges directly on the Vatican where four alleged co-conspirators were indicted for the murder of former Vatican financial advisor and Propaganda Due Lodge member Roberto Calvi. His suicide/murder was one of the things that occasioned an investigation on the part of John Paul II into the scandal surrounding the Vatican Bank, and one of the guys he brought in was a fellow named Hermann Abs. Perhaps we can talk about him later. But right about the same time, there was a story that appeared in the media where a lawsuit against the Vatican Bank that had originally been thrown out by a lower U.S. court was reinstated. And, John, according to report, you are no stranger to that lawsuit.
Yeah, I'm on retainer as the intelligence advisor for the lawsuit. The lawsuit essentially represents people, Jews and non-Jews, who were victims of the Nazis in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Croatian area, where the Croatian fascist party stole their money and then laundered it out through the Vatican down to Argentina after World War II. The Vatican was rather shocked. They made a huge mistake at the outset of the case. When they read the lawsuit that we filed, someone marked it up and scribbled comments in the margins and then returned it. Well, that was proof that they had read it. And it was terribly important to assert jurisdiction over the Vatican because they couldn't deny that they had read the complaint and were familiar with its content.
Now, the imbroglio surrounding the Vatican Bank and the looting of funds from Holocaust victims and a variety of other sordid activities was the focal point of a book that you co-authored again with Mark Ahrens called Unholy Trinity. We've spoken about some of your other books in the past, John, but not Unholy Trinity at all.
Well, Unholy Trinity essentially was the things that were censored out of my first book, The Belarus Secret.
Mm-hmm. I
was told when I submitted, because I had all these very high security clearances, that my books would always have to undergo review by various different agencies, the pre-publication committees. And they said, no, we can't mention anything about the Vatican and their role in helping the Nazis, so that has to all be stricken out. They said, no, we can't mention anything about the Vatican and their role in helping the Nazis, so that has to all be stricken out. That just annoyed me, so of course we went and found a legal way to get all this information into the public domain. Essentially, we had a very enterprising kid from Britain who spoke Serbo-Croatian fluently, and he posed as a young fascist, and went around and interviewed all the surviving Croatian fascist priests and tape recorded them, and thinking that he was another young Nazi looking for the history of this wonderful thing that they had done. The priest blabbed into our tape recorder about how the Vatican smuggled all the Nazi money out, smuggled all the Nazis out, and it was devastating. I mean, the Vatican, in essence, blew the whistle on themselves. And we played the tapes back to various government agencies, and they said, all right, we can't censor you anymore. They've already exposed themselves. So we got permission to go ahead with the book.
Really? One of the things that's so interesting about the book, John, is the detailing of the history of Vatican financial dealings with the Nazis and with the fascists in general, something which, as you point out, has been oversimplified in the past for ideological reasons. Let's start with La Popessa and some of the disclosures that you relate concerning some goings-on right at the end of World War I.
Sure. When Pacelli, who later became Pope Pius XII, was serving in Germany after World War I, he was terrified of the communists. And his personal assistant was a nun and a faithful secretary. La Popessa was her nickname, the little woman pope. She witnessed him handing over bags of cash from the Vatican to fund political activism, and he was handing it personally to Adolf Hitler. So, in many ways, the infant Nazi party got a little help from the Roman Catholic Church.
And again, that was Papal Nuncio to Munich, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. Actually, I guess he was an archbishop at that point. Anyway, later the fellow who became better known as Pope Pius XII, and his assistant, Sister Pascalina Leonard, also known as La Popessa, in a book by Paul Murphy of the same name. John, one of the things you point out in Unholy Trinity is how the Lateran Treaty led to a much larger relationship between German heavy industry and the Vatican. And now, ultimately, the Vatican got a lot of money from this, and that, in turn, as you mentioned, was invested in German heavy industry.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of American investors at the time, and they're telling the Vatican the real smart way to put their money would be to put it in Germany. As Germany, after World War I, seemed like a weird place to invest because it was bankrupt. It was destitute. It would take, a wheelbarrow full of marks in order to be able to purchase a loaf of bread. But precisely because the currency was so bad, that meant that foreign investors who had access to gold could buy up German corporations at a song, and that's what the Americans were doing. Part of the reason for the huge amount of American investment, and which the Vatican piggybacked on with the proceeds from the Lateran Treaty, was that the Teddy Roosevelt and both Republicans and Democrats passed anti-monopoly laws, anti-cartel legislation, trust busting, and this made it very difficult for the money brokers of Wall Street. Their nickname was the robber barons. Well, they really couldn't rob very well anymore in America because it was now against the law. So what these guys did is they exported their monopolies overseas. And they did that by passing a little-known law. The Webb-Pomerene Act of 1918 was the ultimate loophole law. It says you can't have monopolies and trusts and cartels in America, but you can build them overseas. And so the giant sucking sound was all the American investment capital whistling out of Wall Street into Germany and France and buying up corporate stock. The Vatican just followed along with this trend. In fact, one of the reasons for the Great Depression was so much of the investment capital left the United States in a flood and poured into companies. Now, for example, the ThyssenKrupp Corporation is the wealthiest conglomerate in Europe, and it's secretly owned in substantial part through the Chase Manhattan Bank and then through the Vatican.
And one of the points that you make, or one of the relationships that you trace for a period of decades in Unholy Trinity, is the relationship between Sullivan and Cromwell, an institution called the BIS, or the Bank for International Settlements, and various Swiss banks and the Vatican Bank. And this is one of the relationships that dominates Unholy Trinity. I wonder if you could encapsulate that for us, given the fact this is a huge subject.
The Dulles brothers were partners at the law firm Sullivan Cromwell, and this was the ultimate law firm for the robber barons. This was a firm whose conduct was so reprehensible that it forced the American Bar Association to adopt a canon of ethics to rein in the misdeeds and malpractices of the Sullivan Cromwell law firm. What they did was try and find ways to disguise or cloak American and later British investment in Germany, so that no matter which side won World War II, the investors would get all their money back. So they would have, for example, banks in neutral Amsterdam. They'd have a bank in New York and a bank in Germany. And whichever side won the next war, they would shift the paperwork around and claim that the neutral country owned all the stock. It was a very clever scheme. In fact, George Bush, President Bush's grandfather and great-grandfather, were among the founders of this scheme. They were the clients of the Dulles brothers. They had one of the banks in New York, Union Banking Corporation, was one of the fronts for moving the money around. Now, in 1918 through 1929, this wasn't so bad. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, it was a scandal that these guys were taking money out of America to buy up German stock. But what really became bad was after Hitler came to power, because these same banks were used to launder money to the infant Nazi party. Some people say that some 70% of all the money that went to rebuild the Third Reich came from American and British investors, and to a lesser extent the Vatican investors, as we saw. From La Popessa was an eyewitness to the Pope handing bags of cash to Hitler. It was all being done for good economic purposes, that fascism was a very efficient corporate model for a state. In fact, its early polite name was corporatism, not fascism.
By the way, we should mention that that man eventually became Pope, but at the time he was not Pope. He was the papal nuncio to Munich. Now, this relationship continued on up into World War II and then afterward. I wonder, John, before we get to some of the actual moving of persons through the rat lines, some of the relationship between, again, people or institutions like Sullivan and Cromwell with Allen Dulles, and the Bank for International Settlements, the Swiss Bank, and the Vatican Bank, and how they moved money during the latter part of the war, and how they continued to basically traffic in Nazi monies after the war with an enormous flight capital that overlaps the Vatican Bank and some of the things that you talk about and address in the lawsuit.
Sure. Hitler knew that the Vatican and the American investors really didn't like him. They preferred other parties, the German monarchists, for example. So Hitler had to get control, particularly of the Vatican Bank, because the Vatican Bank was the only bank in the world whose couriers had diplomatic immunity. They could move stocks and bonds and cash in diplomatic pouches, and no one would ever be the wiser. What Hitler did was they seized all the Vatican's assets in Germany, which, quite frankly, were very substantial because after the Lateran Treaty, on Pacelli's advice as the nuncio of Germany, the Vatican stupidly put all of its eggs in one basket, and Hitler was sitting atop the basket. Now, Hitler said to the Catholic Church, if they kept their mouths shut and stayed in line, he would dribble the money back to the Church in dribs and drabs. Now, to accept the dribble, the Vatican created what's called the Vatican Bank, the Institute for Religious Works, the IOR, or its initials in Italian. The Vatican Bank was established to receive the funds that Hitler had absconded with. And so throughout World War II, the Church was silent. And it was silent in substantial part, I believe, because it was either that or complete bankruptcy. They'd never get their money back unless they played ball with Hitler.
Now, ultimately, as the war began to wind down, the Vatican Bank and Sullivan and Cromwell and the Bank for International Settlements began to get a lot of this Nazi money out of Europe. Could you tell us how the Vatican Bank figured into that relationship with, again, Sullivan and Cromwell, the Dulles law firm, BIS, and also an institution that we have not addressed on the air before, something called the World Commerce Corporation. That's something that most people have never heard about, and yet it's a very, very significant element in the latter part of the history of the 20th century.
The Dulles brothers knew that after every war, some of their clients had lost money because the Trading with the Enemy Act would be enforced, and that literally investment money in Germany would be seized for war reparations to pay the cost of a wrongful war. And with the Nazis, the Dulles brothers knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that any money that was invested in Germany would be gone unless it was carefully hidden. So one of the ways they had to hide it was the Bank of International Settlements in Sweden and Switzerland that kept the money moving during the war. It was probably essential to the German war machine. Very few people realize that some 30 to 40% of all the imports of war material to Nazi Germany during World War II came through Switzerland. That's how in bed they were with the Third Reich. Switzerland was by no means a neutral nation. Switzerland was heart and soul in bed with the Third Reich.